So tonight's speaker is CBC member Mari Reed. Mari is a local photographer whose glorious photos have been published in books, magazines, and calendars worldwide. She's won numerous awards, including highly commended for Birds in Flight in the 2023 Bird Photographer of the Year contest. Her articles and photo essays about bird behavior and bird photography have appeared in Living Bird, Bird Watching, Nature's Best, and Wild Planet, among others. She's authored and co-authored 6 books, including the best-selling title, Mastering Bird Photography, The Art, Craft, and Techniques of Photographing Birds and Their Behavior. This evening she'll be sharing her story about obstacles, challenges, and adventures returning to a bird photographer's paradise located on a remote island group far out into the Bering Sea. So please join me in a very warm welcome as Mari presents Return to Puffin Paradise, Alaska's Pribilof Islands.
Well, hello. There are certain places you visit that capture your heart, and forever after you feel that pull to go back. Well, Alaska's Pribilof Islands are one of those places for me. Since I first went there in 2015, I've dreamed about returning to see these dark basalt cliffs dotted with nesting birds and hearing the crashing waves mingling with the tang of salt spray and the smell of bird guano. But most, I just wanted to see these guys, puffins, because they're guaranteed to bring a smile to your face. And I chose to visit the Pribilofs at the very end of July and into August, which would have coincided with the puffins feeding young, so I would have a better chance of photographing them carrying fish. But the Pribilofs' weather in summer features fog, low cloud, and more fog, so getting to the islands can be an adventure. There are 2 species of puffins that nest here. These are horned puffins, named for the fleshy black horns that extend upward from their orange eye rings. It's easy to see why puffins have been nicknamed clowns of the sea, or for their comical appearance, or sea parrots for their colourful bills. And the yellow part of that bill and the rosette around the gape are actually external plates that are present only during the breeding season. And after breeding, those plates slough off, as do the horns, and the puffin's orange legs and feet turn a dull tan colouring. And there's the tufted puffin, much bigger, bolder bird than the horned, and a bird with a lot of attitude. And it's named for the golden plumes on its crown. So the seabirds here, all of them, are so approachable and easily photographed that the Pribilofs have sometimes been described as the Galapagos of the North. Related to the puffins in the Alcid family are the auklets. And there are 3 species that nest on the Pribilofs, including the crested auklet with its floppy crest and bizarre orange bill. This crest is quite variable in size, both within and between the age groups of birds. And apparently it's an indicator of mate-worthiness because both sexes go for individuals with large crests. And then there are parakeet auklets and also least auklets. There are huge numbers of thick-billed murres here, and noisy and gregarious, and it's their braying calls that are going to dominate the soundscape here. There's an estimated population of 1.5 million thick-billed murres that nest here, and they're the most numerous seabird. And then there are common murres too, in somewhat smaller numbers. And 2 kittiwake species. They're both birds of the far northern oceans, but the black-legged kittiwake is widespread, breeding across the entire northern hemisphere, while the red-legged kittiwake has a much more restricted breeding range. It nests in just 4 locations in the Bering Sea, with the Pribilofs breeders accounting for more than 80% of the world population. And along with the puffins, it was red-legged kittiwake that was one of my goal birds. So where are we exactly? Well, the Pribilofs are a remote 4-island group sitting way out in the Bering Sea, just north of the Aleutian archipelago. A little more than about 750 miles west of Anchorage on the mainland, which is Alaska's largest city. And these islands are part of the Bering Sea unit of the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. Most visitors to the Pribilofs take a direct flight from Anchorage on Raven Alaska Airlines to St. Paul, which is the largest of the Pribilof Islands. It's also possible to take another route to fly to Anchorage, from Anchorage to Dutch Harbour on the Aleutians, and then take a small company called Grant Aviation flight to St. Paul. And most visitors spend all their time on the island of St. Paul because it's got the best tourist infrastructure and the most accessible seabird colonies. St. George is a smaller island, very, very steep cliffs with even larger seabird populations, but much harder access for visitors. And then there are two tiny islands called Otter and Walrus Island that are protected reserves with no human residents, nor any sea otters or walruses, for that matter, at this point. So my adventure actually began nearly 2 years ago, in late July 2022, when I headed to Anchorage, Alaska, and checked into my hotel, the Puffin Inn, where I was thrilled to discover they had puffins on the shower curtains and puffin tiles on the walls. And that made up for the fact that the hotel pillows were just like rocks. You remember those pillows? Oh, but wait a minute, these are Atlantic puffins. This is the wrong hemisphere for these birds. Oh well, at least they got the correct species on the hotel sign anyway. So my first task was to stock up on some healthy and not so healthy food items that might be in short supply or prohibitively expensive on the Pribilofs, and to enjoy Alaskans' propensity for depicting wildlife in sculptures or taxidermies everywhere, especially playing up this fearsomeness of bears they seem to have a passion about. But eventually, time to head back to Anchorage Airport for my flight to St. Paul Island. Well, good luck. It's cancelled due to fog. Raven, Alaska only actually flies 3 times a week to St. Paul, and the next flight was 2 days later, but it's full, so I put on standby. And the next flight with space available after that is 2 days after that, so 4 days after I arrived, so I rebook a seat on that. And so there I was, stuck in Anchorage. Well, what to do? Well, there's lots to do in Anchorage, actually, but of course we want to go birding. And as it happens, the Puffin Inn is right next door to Lake Hood, which is home of the Lake Hood seaplane base, which bills itself as the largest and busiest seaplane base in the world. It also has some pretty good birds, depending on the time of year, such as scaup. I'm going to call these graters, and you can argue with me, I don't know well enough, but in spring you're going to see small flocks of these ducks performing their courtship flights, which is what they're doing here. And then in late summer, if you're stuck like I was, they're going to be broods that spot on the water. There are red-necked grebes here too. Lake Hood has got those both in spring and in summer. And then my best bird here for me was the red-throated loon. So beautiful birds aside, it's kind of hard to ignore the constant stream of seaplanes taking off and landing on the lake. Although at first, at least for the first couple of times, that can be almost as interesting as watching birds take flight and land, but much, much noisier. And many of these small planes are taking tourists on sightseeing flights into the interior for salmon fishing or wildlife viewing or just looking at the mountains. But others actually provide a vital service. They're providing supplies and passenger links to Alaska's many remote villages in the interior that have no road access. And if you run out of birds, you can watch the planes. You can marvel at the variety of undercarriages they have. Floats for taking flight or for landing on water. Big fat overinflated bush tires that enable the planes to land on the tundra on dry riverbeds and so on. Even skis for landing on snow. And this is a special vintage model of plane built before the invention of the wing. I'm told once it's airborne, it's okay, but the bumpy landings and takeoffs. So at this point I'm wondering about my own flight and the standby flight. Well, that wasn't going to work because it was full and there was no space for me. So I checked out of the Puffin Inn and rented an Airbnb near Anchorage, described as a mountainside retreat with regular wildlife sightings. Yep, that's what it is. And that's where I met a much more realistic, friendlier, much friendlier version of a bear. It's a young black bear that tried to make itself welcome into my Airbnb. I suppose it was encouraged by the welcome mat. I can hardly blame it. So driving along the coast for some scenic viewing, and then to go to another birding spot, Potter Marsh, where in spring you might see waterfowl such as trumpeter swans and Arctic terns. If you're there in late summer, you can actually watch migrating salmon in some of the creeks that come in here. With time on your hands, you can visit the Alaska Native Heritage Center in Anchorage and learn about Alaska's many indigenous tribes and their cultures. Or you can take the 2-hour plus drive southward to Seward and spend the day exploring the Alaska Sea Life Center, which is a wonderful public aquarium where, among other things, you can watch captive puffins and other marine life swimming underwater in a giant aquarium. It's actually 2 stories high. Now, this tufted puffin, I admit, is a junky shot, but it shows what I'd hoped, that puffins and other alcids actually fly underwater using their wings to propel themselves along. Here's a tufted puffin and a common murre underwater. And in this same aquarium tank, there are sea ducks, so you can compare how they use their feet and legs, not their wings, to swim underwater. And you can watch also in the same tank sea otters and seals and other marine life. But eventually it's back to the airport. And it's Groundhog Day. The flight to St. Paul is cancelled, once again, due to fog. And the next flight is 3 days later. Well, the killing time in Anchorage is getting really expensive. So I decided fate was against me, and I went home, only to arrive again a year later. This time though, July 2023, things are looking good. They've handed out boarding passes. There's actually a pilot who looks like he's getting, or she's getting on the plane. They're loading the bags onto the plane, and woohoo, we're invited to board, and we're off. It's about a 3-hour flight from Anchorage to St. Paul Island on a 25-seater plane. There's a refueling stop on the way just before you leave the Alaska mainland, when Raven, Alaska actually will reevaluate the weather situation. Bad weather, as I said, is the norm in the Pribilofs, and the flights are often forced to turn back, sometimes even if they're within St. Paul airspace, because by law they require a 500-foot cloud ceiling to land. But everything is going good, this is going well this time. Unfortunately, the weather cooperated, and by late afternoon, the plane descended through the cloud layer to reveal the coastline and the lush green landscape of St. Paul. And what looks like golf course sand traps here are actually sand dunes. It's not a giant golf course. Sand dunes covered by low vegetation. And shortly after that, we arrived at the tiny airport. This is the first Raven, Alaska flight to have been able to land on St. Paul for 10 days. Hold that thought, because it will come up again later. No worries about getting to your hotel, though. You don't need an Uber because the airport is the hotel. You walk past the airline counter straight into a long hallway with dorm-style rooms on either side and shared bathrooms. Don't be deceived, though, by its humble exterior. The rooms are actually very clean and comfortable. And there's a fully equipped commercial-sized kitchen where we would have our meals. And it's time to meet one of my guides. I had 2 different guides over this trip, which was about 7 days, at least was intended to be. And we're going to head out to find some birds now. Last time I was here in 2015, the tour vehicle was a battered old bus. But now, hey, it's a Mercedes van. So probably the only time in my life I'll be able to brag about being driven around in a Mercedes. The island of St. Paul is pretty small. It's only about 13 miles from one end to the other. And the human population, around 450, mostly indigenous Aleuts, lives in the village of St. Paul in the south. That's where all the seabird nest colonies are too, very high cliffs that were in the south and west part of the island. And that's where the visitors are going to spend most of their time. In the north and east areas, they have rocky beaches and an assortment of shallow ponds and lakes and so on. But our first stop was Reef Point, which is the island's showcase bird cliff, located just outside the village of St. Paul. You take a short path hugging the cliffside and sweeping steeply up to a high rocky outcrop, which is a favorite hangout of scores of approachable birds. And then as you climb upward, there are several notches in the cliff where you can lean over once you get the nerve to do so and get remarkably close views of the birds, such as a horned puffin nestled in on a lichen-covered rock. And this one's a bit shyer, trying to decide whether to come out and face the paparazzi. The tufted puffins snoozing, preening and flapping photogenically, or just contemplating the waves. And I wanted to show those waves breaking in a shot to tell more of a story about the puffin and its habitat. So here I left the bird small in the frame by zooming my 200 to 600 millimeter lens back to 200 millimeters. And then I shot plenty of images to capture the perfect wave. So there were plenty of willing puffin subjects here, not so the crested auklets. And this was the species we saw the least of on this trip anyway, because they're very early breeders. And by late July, they would have already raised their young and headed back to sea. But luckily, there was one pair still remaining at Reef Point. Their crests are kind of skimpy because they're losing them at this point in the season. Awfully cute. So Reef Point's awesome for easily accessible close-up views of the seabirds, like these thick-billed murres, and sometimes it has some in-your-face flight shots too. But for the sheer numbers of birds, nothing beats Ridge Wall on the south side of the island. Much, much higher cliffs, not such close views, but so many birds. And there's constant activity and a constant cacophony of braying and screeching from hundreds of murres and kittiwakes and puffins and auklets, all going about their nesting busyness. You can walk out on a high promontory, then either look out to sea and photograph the numerous birds flying to and fro, or shoot back toward the cliffs for perch birds. You have to be a lot more cautious about getting too close to the edge of these cliffs. There's no more leaning over the cliff edges like a reef. And plus add to that slippery vegetation, constant buffeting by the wind that threatened always to knock me and my gear off balance and threatened to have me crashing down onto the rocks. On the other hand, I did need to get fairly close to that precarious edge to see all the way down to the base of the cliff where the red-legged kittiwakes were hanging out and nesting, because that was one of my goal species, and they're all the way down there. So it's late July, and the kittiwakes have large chicks at this point. On this nest, there was always one parent standing on the nest every time I was there, and I was there multiple days, sheltering that chick from the weather. Very exposed here. And there's the second adult perched above is probably the mate. Very exposed cliff face. It was often very, very windy, and I was constantly worried that this little fluffball chick would get blown off that narrow ledge, because there's a long drop down below to the rocks. But there was always an adult there. Kittiwake nests consist of a platform of mud, kind of a tall platform, mixed with vegetation of mud and topped with a shallow cup. There are very few narrow ledges that are suitable for those nests to be made, so they're fiercely defended. There are kittiwakes of both species constantly cruising up and down the cliff face, trying to lay claim to a piece of real estate, to have a nest on it, or simply wanting somewhere to land and rest. So here an intruder has managed to land, but the adult on the nest has spread its wings over the chick to protect it, much as raptors will mantle a prey. And everyone's screaming. The nest owners did manage to fend off this intruder. And while the adults were very attentive to the chick over the several days I watched at this nest, one thing I didn't see was them feeding the chick. Maybe that's because red-legged kittiwakes often hunt for food at night. 4 days later, though, that chick is much larger and bolder and standing up to preen and stretch its wings, so it's obviously being fed, just maybe not when I was seeing it. And regarding the nocturnal feeding, much of red-legged's diet is small sea creatures that move up in the water column to the water surface at night. And this includes squid, and it includes some members of an interesting family of fishes, the lampfishes or lantern fishes, so called because they exhibit bioluminescence. Actually, both kittiwake species may forage at night, but the red-legged has one characteristic that likely gives it an edge for nocturnal feeding. It's got big eyes relative to its head size. So we've got 3 red-legs here with a black-legged kittiwake in the upper left. Obviously, you can see the legs are coloured differently, but notice that the red-leg's got a smaller, rounder head, a shorter bill, and kind of larger eyes for the head size. So there were alcids at Ridgewall that one could get down close to, but I had to be brave and slide myself down with my camera over the cliff edge, down into a kind of a notch below the cliff edge. It was definitely between a rock and a hard place, but once I was down there and settled, it was wonderful. There was a whole new part of the cliff face became visible. And woohoo, there's a puffin party going on. So the ledge is available for the birds to rest on, or a hot commodity, so probably what's going on here is a bit of jostling for some space. But lower down, there was a group of horned puffins doing some interesting displays to each other. They point their bills straight up while opening and closing their bills in slow motion and jerking their heads back and forth. I took a look in Birds of the World about this behaviour, and it says this bill-jerking display occurs during courtship, but it can also occur in other contexts too. I don't know whether they were actually making calls or anything when they were opening their bills, because there's such a lot of noise I couldn't figure it out.
Put it to music next time, Mari.
Okay, next time. Okay. I'm not sure what was going on here. I think maybe Steve Press might have some inkling about what displays are doing, but we'll talk about that later maybe. But it could be that they're investigating nest sites. This is possibly a nest, I'm not sure, but horned puffins nest in rock crevices, and that's where they all were, checking out the rock crevices, unlike the tufted and Atlantic puffins that more often dig burrows in soil for their nests. There were some parakeet auklets too in the same area that were having an open house. Maybe not the most friendly of open houses. Watching all these seabirds hanging out on the cliffs, you can't fail to be struck how they can use even the narrowest, steepest little ledges to perch and rest, and even to sleep. So especially the alcids, like the horned puffin on the right, sleeping on this little tiny ledge. So how do they do it? Well, alcid toads have large claws, so they can grip these porous volcanic rocks. If you look at the close-ups of the rock, there's lots of little holes in them. They can grip. The alcids, it works okay, but I don't think that's true of the kittiwakes, though. They also try and land on tiny ledges, but with less success, which made for some dramatic takeoff shots if you're a photographer. And if you can tear yourself away from the cliffs, there's endless activity on and over the ocean. There's constant opportunities to capture the flying birds. And for those interested, I'm using a Sony A9 camera here with a 200 to 600 millimeter lens. So now most of what you've seen up till now was taken, supported on a tripod, but for any flight shots like here, I hand hold that gear. And I have a special telephoto handle to make that a bit easier. So black-legged kittiwakes here in a feeding frenzy over a school of small fish. If I took a close look at some of the pictures, I can see the little tiny fish in their bills. Or in a mid-air fight near the colonies. And of course I photographed every tufted or horned puffin that flew by, hoping for that elusive fish carrying shot. It wasn't easy to come by though. I did see a few puffins carrying nest material. This horned puffin has a beak full of feathers to line its nest. And it seemed kind of late for the birds to be building nests at this point in late July, early August. But one of my researcher friends told me they actually play with nesting material throughout the breeding season. Some birds definitely were feeding young at this point. Take a look at this parakeet auklet's throat. It's bulging out, full of food. They feed on planktonic forms of jellyfish and crustaceans or small fish larvae. So you're not going to see them carrying those in their bill. And these auklets are really fast flyers. But I love the challenge of capturing birds in flight, so I was happy to stay on the spot for hours on end. And as time went by, I started to push my creative boundaries. So a tufted puffin here with a wave breaking over the dark rocks at the base of the cliff, forming a cool diagonal pattern. It was hard to drag myself away from these windy cliffs, but you know, there are other creatures to photograph here in the interior too. There are songbirds. The Pribilofs are actually a premium birding spot during spring and fall for rare migrant songbirds from Asia. But there's only a handful of songbirds that actually reside here year-round. And one that's more likely to be heard than seen is the Pacific wren. It's a species that once was lumped with our winter wren. Other year-round residents, grey-crowned rosy finches. A male on the right and a female on the left with nest material. And colour leg bands put there by a researcher who's studying them. So these finches seem to take up the niche filled by house sparrows at home here, living around human habitation, including around our hotel, and chirping away merrily from the eaves. And a snow bunting, as we never see it here, in breeding plumage, male, surrounded by flowers. And likewise a Lapland longspur. And the flowers are a sight in themselves. So these greenish umbelliform flowers are known as puchki, or wild celery, and I'm told people actually do eat it, or you cook it, I guess. The pink flowers go by the unflattering name of world lousewort. And there are furred as well as feathered creatures, of course. The most obvious being the northern fur seal. Here's a fur seal rookery with the village of St. Paul in the distance. Now, fur seals were the reason the Pribilofs were first settled by humans, and it's not a pretty story. In the 1800s, Russian fur traders forcibly relocated native people from the Aleutian Islands, basically enslaving them to process the seal pelts. And later, when America took over, the companies continued this practice, leading to the seals almost being hunted to extinction for these wonderful luxuriant fur pelts. Luckily, the population has bounced back after the northern fur seal was protected under the US Marine Mammal Protection Act. And I think there's more than 1 million, I think now, in number. The native Alaskans do reserve the right to carry out subsistence hunts, but there is no fur hunting. On St. Paul, the natives take only the 2-year-old males, and this is a big, mature bull. And he's in this awkward position, he's scratching with one of his hind flippers. And if you look on the sides of his head, those tightly rolled things, those are ears protruding from the side of his head. 2 of the largest fur seal rookeries have got permanent blinds from which you can spend lots of time closely watching the seals if you want. And the big bulls are known as beach masters, these huge tough guys that have outcompeted all the neighbouring bulls and earned the right to lord it over a harem of much smaller females. It doesn't look to me like he's whispering sweet nothings to them, but they seem all blissed out by him anyway. And these harems can number 100 females, or up to 100, and each of those will give birth to 1 dark-furred pup, is the pups per year. And of course they're awkward, lumbering animals on land, but in the water they're sleek, fast-moving and graceful. And watching from the cliffs, we often would see them speeding by, leaping under the water at intervals like dolphins. And now watch out, because it's time for a squee alert. Arctic fox kids. The fox on the Pribilofs is a species of Arctic fox known as the blue fox for the colour of its fur. And these 4 were growing up in a den under a culvert, under a road. But these foxes can be seen all around St. Paul Island, even in the village of St. Paul, where they tend to be scavengers. And they're very entertaining as they go into rough and tumble play fights. Fights? No, not flights, fights. 2 obsessed with birds. And they're pretty used to seeing van loads of tourists go by and stopping and hearing the constant clicking of camera shutters. And they really have got adorable faces of innocence until you realise that what he's doing is eating a meal of myrrh. So, of course, Arctic foxes are the seabirds' main predators, taking many eggs and chicks. And how they get down into those colonies, they patrol the cliff edges, and they'll venture into the colonies along any kind of non-vertical paths they can find. And as I mentioned, the foxes living near St. Paul village also scavenge human food, scraps and waste. And one of those mammals that's kind of an anomaly here is reindeer. They're not native, but they were introduced in the early 1900s from Russian stock. Reindeer the world over survive on lichens. With global warming, people were very concerned that the lichens don't survive, neither would the reindeer. But on St. Paul, that's not been the case. They quickly decimated all the original lichens, and they switched to grasses and roots, and they thrived. From that original 25 individuals flock, the herd now numbers about 800. Said flock, didn't I? Oh no, it is a flock, yes. And they are hunted both by the local residents, and hunting tours come from the mainland too to hunt them. Some things I didn't know about reindeer, a couple of things. Healthy female reindeer have antlers as large as the males, and there's a great deal of natural colour variation, from very dark to almost white. I don't know where Rudolph is in this group, but he must be in there somewhere. So my trip is drawing to a close now, and what does that have to do with wind turbines in the fog? Well, those bad weather conditions that make it hard to get to St. Paul also make it hard to leave. So these turbines were my indicator of the likelihood of the Raven Air flights being able to land for the flight back to Anchorage. And there were days when I could not see the tops of them. Those were bad days. Some of the staff and researchers, as well as a number of local residents, had been anxiously waiting to leave the island for days, enduring constant flight cancellations. And we all look jolly here because, other than me, they'd managed to secure seats on a much smaller aircraft operated by Grant Aviation that flies to Dutch Harbour in the Aleutians, where you can then fly on to Anchorage. So they all left. And to cut a long story short, I got stuck on St. Paul for another 3 days. One day it was so rainy and windy we couldn't even go out. It was just me and one guide and this empty, cavernous kitchen. Puffin paradise it may be, but to be stuck there actually felt a little unnerving. But once the weather cleared up, it was back to the seabird cliffs, and woohoo, I finally got my picture of a puffin carrying fish. But eventually I also opted for the Grant Aviation flight to Dutch Harbour, and then with my boarding pass to Anchorage in hand, I headed for the bar to celebrate my escape from puffin paradise. There you go. Thanks.
So if folks have questions for Mari,
You want to turn the lights up a bit so I can see these? Oh yeah, well, hi.
Mary, that looks like a seabird paradise. What about shorebirds? Were there any nesting
Oh, okay.
shorebirds around the
Nesting shorebirds I'm not sure about. There may be red-necked phalaropes may be nesting there. But we didn't actually, on this trip I didn't spend any time in any of the wetlands or much on the beaches. There are, during migration, there are ruddy turnstones. Often they're in groups. And often rock sandpipers, that's one of the birds that's there a lot, yeah. But not much else. Yeah.
So you mentioned the wind, so how, it must have been hard to get those video shots into the wind.
Yeah, it was. I threw away many red-legged kittiwake shots of the videos that weren't good enough. Yeah, they really were difficult. So that's why the reef colony was much more sheltered, so you could get some fairly decent stuff there. And when I was down in that notch, it was quite sheltered, so that was good. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. What was the temperature of the air and the water? You were wearing a heavy coat.
Oh yeah. So I would say that in general, the temperatures really never get into the 60s in a summer on St. Paul. It's usually 40s, 50s. On the other hand, it doesn't go down much at night, so it's pretty constant. But it's always windy, it can be rainy, it's always overcast. We didn't have any sunny days on this trip. The 2015 trip, I think I had 2 sunny days at the end, sunny-ish days at the end. And the water temperature, I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
Nobody swims it.
I
No one swims there.
I didn't want to try and find out.
I have one more question. In one photo, you've got this camera with this enormous lens, and the lens is covered with white stuff that looks like bird droppings. That's the case. Camouflage.
I'm not quite sure what I've got a cover on it, but it's camouflage. I'm not sure it's like bird droppings, but I've got lots of things covered with bird droppings, including a whole selection of hats. And what was the last bit?
That's what it looked like to me.
Okay, all right, yeah. That'll be good camouflage. Yeah.
Did you see any red-faced cormorants?
Yes, yeah. I didn't take any pictures of them this trip because there wasn't a good situation for them. But on my previous trip, I got some great red-faced cormorants. Yeah.
What was the question?
Did I see any red-faced cormorants? They're beautiful. Yeah.
When you go on a trip like this, or someplace else, you have certain goal birds that you want to get photos of, and you allow a certain amount of time. If your flight gets canceled and then canceled again, do you have the ability to extend that, or are you cut off at a hard deadline and say, I gotta go?
So I'll explain how you get to St. Paul for a start. Most people either go on a birding tour with an independent tour leader, or they go on a photography tour with an independent photography leader. So they cost extra money, but all of those tours still go through the native corporation that arranges the tours on the island, on St. Paul Island. So if you're on one of those tours, you're kind of stuck because you haven't paid for any extra time. I actually went independently this time. You cannot actually go to St. Paul without going through the native corporation, because there's no hotel, there's no restaurant, there's no car hire available unless you know somebody privately. You have to be with a guide, so you pay for a tour with them, and then you can extend it. You know, what were they going to do? Kick me off the island? And I couldn't get off the island, so I just basically stayed longer, and they charged me. Now I did have to scramble around and change all my hotels and flights at the other end. So to get back home, you know, and that cost time and money and stress. And, I threw money at this, just willy-nilly. Yeah. It was worth it.
Yeah.
What else am I going to do with my money at this stage of life? So does that explain how you get there, how you?
In that particular situation, yeah, that does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So people go on, the birding tours often go in May, when migration's happening, when there are all these Russian and Asian migrants coming through, and in October, when the same kind of thing is happening. And the photography and general nature people more often go in June or July, and sometimes in August. Crazy people like me go in August and face the fog. Oh yeah, I was going to say, do you have any inkling onto the display?
Yeah, I just want to say a couple thoughts about that display. That's called head jerking.
Yeah.
And in the spring, the pair, it's a courtship display.
Okay.
But later on, it can be an aggressive display.
Okay. Yeah.
And by late July, I saw some birds opening their beaks up, doing a slow, exaggerated gape display, which is very aggressive.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah, so, and then there were birds flying in that were like being repelled by the birds on the cliff. So those were probably breeders,
Oh.
and those were probably young prospectors.
Oh.
A breeder can live to be 20 or 25 years old,
Okay.
and young prospectors are looking for
Okay.
new nesting places.
Okay.
And so that's probably what was going on, head jerking and the displays, repelling prospectors out of that
Cool.
ledge. And then the bird walking with the feathers probably was a prospector too, because they will build a nest the year before they breed. And so that's
Oh, okay.
probably
Yeah. Well, that's cool. That's great
beginning
info.
to nest.
Yeah.
That's what.
And so I showed a photo of what looked like a puffin sitting way back in a tunnel that I presume was a nest, because that bird stayed very still for hours and hours, and it was always there multiple days. I couldn't see anything like an egg or anything, but to me that looked like, you know, had to have been a nest.
It could be sitting on, it could be a young bird defending a territory, or an older bird defending
Yeah.
a nest.
Well, this was inside the crevice.
Yeah, they nest underground.
Yeah, it's fun. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is the cacophony of bird sounds like non-stop, 24 hours a day?
Yep. Yep. Screaming kittiwakes, the braying sounds, or the murres. And I think puffins make sound, but I think they're very low frequency, what Bob would know. And they probably wouldn't be able to hear them under that. And then, of course, the crashing waves and the wind, and it's just wonderful.
Is it hard to hear someone talking to you, next to you?
Yeah, we pretty much had to shout at each other. Yeah. But I'm used to that. Yeah.
You were on St. Paul in the Aleutian chain.
No, it's north of the Aleutians.
It's north of.
Yes, yes.
Where is Attu in
Well, that's
relation to that?
way out at the other end of the western end of the Aleutians. It's like one of the last little tiny islands on the Aleutians. So that big sweep of an arc and it's way out.
Wow.
Yep.
Mark,
Yeah.
what did your guide do while you were sitting and photographing for hours?
That's interesting. So my guide was from Colombia. So he didn't particularly like the cold weather. But once he got used to the fact that my schedule meant I'm going out there and I'm not coming back for 3 hours, he actually would go and sit in a van and had like a bed set up in the back and he would sleep in the van. He also was a really hot birder. So sometimes he'd go off, you know, on his own, sometimes with the band, sometimes not, and go scouting for other birds, because it was heading toward the time when migration might be starting. He was particularly looking for vagrant shorebirds. Yeah.
So if you slipped off the cliff, you might not be there for a
Well,
couple hours.
we did talk about that. We did talk about that, yes. Although they did say, you know, there's not much we're going to be able to do for you. You know, what are you going to do? Like, rappel down there? Nah, sorry. I mean, they might be able to get the Coast Guard out. Well, let's not even think about it. They haven't lost a person yet. They've been doing these tours for, I don't know, 40 years or something. It's worth a visit, but do be flexible and expect to get delayed. You know, I mean, sometimes it's just easy, at other times it's not. So.
Mari, I have one more question. How did you find the guide?
The which?
How did you find your guide?
Oh, they're employed there. So the native corporation is called TDX, and each year they employ a bunch of guides who reside on the island. I think there are usually 4 of them in the mid summer. And they're all incredibly good birders, and they're all avid, you know, like rarity chasers, basically. Yeah.
Were there any rarities while you were there?
I wasn't really tuned into them. What did we have one year? 2015, there was a Mongolian sand plover or something like that. I'm not good enough to know. There was a wandering tattler, but I don't think they're necessarily that rare, because you do find them in North America, right? Yeah.
So I take it that there's not many opportunities to get eye level with the birds, because you're always up here, the birds are down there, or do you try?
Well, I mean, it's pretty eye level with the parakeet auklets doing their stuff. But yeah, you're looking down. I mean, you can. There are places you can get eye level. If you would, yeah. I mean, sometimes the flying birds are eye level. That is weird and wonderful. They just like cruise by and look at you. It's fun. Well, thank you all.